the cathedral, and the bazaar. Linus's law and the processes around it typify the internet culture, where nobody is in charge and information is freely available. I'll comment on its implications for networks and economics in Chapter 11. My point in raising it now is to illustrate a different point, that both cathedrals and bazaars are useful, competing methods of human cooperation and exchange. Competition between different groups, organized into corporations with different styles and structures, some more like the bazaar, others more like the cathedral, and organized into different societies, some more united than others, drives progress. Sometimes it's useful to have large-scale and more proprietary exclusiveness, sometimes smaller scale and greater openness. And insofar as we can generalize on what is better, the answer appears to be an intermediate degree of concentration or fragmentation. Diamond's principle of intermediate fragmentation. Jared Diamond, professor of physiology at UCLA Medical School, has proposed the principle that intermediate fragmentation is optimal in business and society. He writes, "You don't want excessive unity, and you don't want excessive fragmentation. Instead, you want your human society or business to be broken up into a number of groups which compete with each other, but which also maintain relatively free communication with each other." Diamond argues that Renaissance China had a huge technological lead over Europe. For example, in 1400, China had the world's largest fleet, comprising hundreds of ships and total crews of 20,000 men. But in 1432, a new emperor sided with the anti-navy faction and decided to dismantle the shipyards and stop sending out the ships. And because the emperor was in charge of this huge nation, that was it. Diamond contrasts the centralization of decision-making in China with what happened with ocean-going fleets in Europe. Columbus wanted a fleet to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. Being Italian, he tried to raise support in Italy. Everyone in Italy thought it was a stupid idea. So, Columbus tried again in France, with the same result. He traipsed from country to country until finally, at the 7th attempt, the King and Queen of Spain conceded him 3 small ships. Europe's fragmentation made Columbus's voyage possible, leading to European colonial empires. But Diamond observes that extreme fragmentation, as exists in India, favors innovation little better than extreme centralization. And he points out that many industries have a minimum efficient scale, so that an extremely fragmented and geographically protected industry, like brewing in Germany, cannot be as efficient as a more concentrated and competitive one like America's beer industry. As Adam Smith observed, too small a market constrains specialization. A highly localized market is likely to be less efficient than a continental or global one. Hence the virtues of intermediate fragmentation, where competition and collaboration coexist. The ideal model, according to Diamond, is Silicon Valley, which consists of lots of companies that are fiercely competitive with each other, but nevertheless, there's a lot of collaboration. And despite the competition, there is a free flow of ideas and a free flow of information between these companies. In other words, a landscape with many cathedrals, many bazaars, and free flows of information, competition, and cooperation. Higher still and higher, the bounds of cooperation rise. Human and business evolution are stories of ever-increasing cooperation. Starting with the family and the small clan, and a series of subsistence, local economies of hunter-gatherers, we have developed into a complex interdependent collection of larger societies and economies characterized by ever-increasing degrees of specialization in trade. Trade in goods and services, in ideas, in technologies, in roles, and in payments from one group to another. Specialization and trade are positive-sum games. They create wealth that didn't exist before. They are grounded in reciprocity. They require the habit of collaboration and cooperation for long-term advantage. They require us to look beyond short-term calculations of who benefits from individual transactions. They require not selfishness, but a long-term, sophisticated view of self-interest and the habits of daily give and take. They require competition and cooperation, the pursuit of individual and corporate enrichment, and the willingness to enrich other individuals, groups, and society at large. They require social and individual habits of trust, openness, intelligence, and retribution on those who withhold cooperation. They require a balance between high scale and concentration, which aid efficiency at any point in time, and fragmented decision-making, which is the best guarantee of dynamism and long-term progress. They require us to have freedom to change, at the drop of a hat, those with whom we choose to collaborate, not because of whim or short-termism, but because conditions shift and change our perception of where our long-term interests lie. Competition and cooperation are not opposites. They are necessary complements. Competition is a civilized way of ensuring that we cooperate at the level of society. Because we compete for our livings, we ensure that all workers add social value. The market mediates a potential conflict between how we would like to spend our time and how others want us to spend it. All business activity requires cooperation, even for sole traders. The advance of business requires ever greater social and material exchange, which themselves require trust, friendship, cooperation, the stick of competition, and the carrot of gain. Ultimately, both competition and cooperation are social virtues and expressions of tolerance and reciprocity. Selfish genes require humans to behave generously and selflessly. As when the prisoner's dilemma is played repeatedly, long-term rewards are reaped by cooperation rather than by pursuing short-term self-interest. The long-term approach requires commitment, valuing trustworthiness for its own sake. Only by behaving in a consistently trustworthy manner, ignoring the opportunities where short-term advantage is available at no cost, will individuals be recognized as trustworthy, which creates the most valuable opportunities. Thus, cooperation is based on reciprocity but goes far beyond it. Only by generosity and selflessness, by practicing fairness, is it possible to reap the rich rewards of cooperation. Cooperation is motivated by selfish genes, but it requires selfless behavior. Humans are programmed by emotion rather than reason, but emotions are highly functional mental devices for guaranteeing commitment. As in later versions of The Prisoner's Dilemma, the cooperative join forces to cooperate with each other. As Ridley says, "The virtuous are virtuous for no other reason than to join forces with others who are virtuous to mutual benefit. And once cooperators segregate themselves from the rest of society, a wholly new force of evolution can come into play, one that pits groups against each other rather than individuals." The Prisoner's Dilemma and Your Career. For individuals, business life, like the Prisoner's Dilemma game, is best seen as the gradual unfolding of a series of opportunities to cooperate. No transaction is an independent event. The link is your skill at cooperating, the number and quality of people who will cooperate with you, and your reputation. The development of a career in business is not so much about building technical skills as it is about building valuable contacts, people who want to do business with you. Summary. Modern solutions to the prisoner's dilemma provide a good model of how to behave in business and life. Provided that business is more than a single transaction, which it nearly always is, the dominant strategy is to cooperate, but to punish failure to cooperate in others by withholding your own cooperation until reciprocal cooperation is restored. Humans have carried cooperation to its highest stage. We are not more altruistic than other animals, but we do live in large and interrelated groups. We have carried cultural learning and knowledge transmission to its highest levels, based on ever-increasing degrees of reciprocity, of sophisticated selfishness. Business genes drive both cooperation and competition. Cooperation and competition are necessary complements. They can only increase together. But cooperation is the more basic process, and for each business gene and individual, the more fundamental. Without cooperation, an individual business gene or an individual person cannot produce anything. Deciding which business genes and people to cooperate with is therefore more basic and important than deciding which business genes and people to compete against. Competition only becomes of paramount importance when it forces itself on you. In its extreme manifestation, when it puts you out of business. Competition then takes you back to the drawing board. It invites you to cooperate in a more successful economic production. Competition takes care of itself. Cooperation requires a prior act of will by individuals. Cooperation and competition make it possible to specialize, trade, and develop technology. These in turn require ever greater interdependence and cooperation. The groups of business genes and individuals that win are those who cooperate best and have the best reciprocal cooperators. Trust is the glue that creates a wealthy and well-functioning society. It's fine to be selfish, but advanced selfishness requires us to be cooperative, selfless, and generous. Our selfish genes have implanted our altruistic and cooperative instincts because this is the way to the highest level of evolution. Short-term selfishness, of the type assumed in conventional economic theory, is relevant only to a small minority of short-term, truly independent, buy-and-sell transactions. Beyond these transactions lie the important parts of life: relationships, both economic and non-economic, and knowledge, emotions, and love. All these transactions require cooperation and trust. Here, displaying short-term self-interest is self-defeating. It tends to undermine trust. The way to get ahead is to have a large network of cooperators, and cooperators find it hard and uncongenial to deal with transparently self-interested people. They will only do so if there is no choice. For a time, greed may drive out cooperation. In the long run, cooperation will drive out greed. Companies and teams of individuals are above all instruments of advanced cooperation. The best cooperators may inherit the earth, provided that they are also good at satisfying selfish customers. Ultimately, the advance of civilization and the evolution of mankind and society require ever greater degrees of scientific and economic knowledge and activity greater specialization, greater trade, greater interdependence, greater competition, and above all, greater cooperation. This is the only way to defeat the war of all against all, and the prevalence of death and misery over health and happiness, the only route to evolutionary disarmament. Action implications. 1. Cooperate with the best cooperators. Build relationships with the cooperators who possess the blend of business and cooperative attributes that can take your career and business to the highest peaks. Remember that the objective of a career is to build an ever-increasing network of skilled cooperators. 2. Build a reputation as someone who creates wealth for others and who is totally trustworthy. Keep your word without calculation of short-term gain. 3. Always cooperate in the first instance. Trust others until they prove themselves unworthy of your trust. Only withdraw cooperation from non-cooperators. Punish the latter, but then rebuild mutual self-interest by clear signals, such as, "I will cooperate if you will, but only if you will." Demonstrate the disadvantages to others of their failure to cooperate. 4. Be willing to take turns in extracting advantage. Understand that reciprocity is a long-term concept, not one requiring mutual advantage in each individual transaction. And finally, 5. Develop the daily habits of cooperation. Teach yourself that cooperation, like thinking and networking, is cumulative and self-reinforcing. It is impossible to deplete your bank balance of cooperativeness by cooperating. Seize all available opportunities to cooperate with useful cooperators, realizing that cooperation builds skill at cooperation, as well as building your reputation, reciprocal obligations, and added skill and cooperation in those with whom you cooperate. Become a cooperation junkie, a cooperation fanatic, an evangelist of cooperation. Always remember, cooperation is the highest form of self-interest. Part 1, Concluding Note. In Chapter 1, we saw that evolution occurs at many levels, but always through the same process of inheritance, experimentation, variation, selection of variants best adapted to the conditions of life, and ruthless culling of inferior variants. Although it takes a very long time, evolution achieves astonishing results, with a luxuriant flowering of all life forms having been derived from one ultimate source. Evolution proceeds through the creation of new variants and new species, which split off from existing forms of life, and through the extinction of less adapted species. Driving the whole process are genes with similar chemical structures but varying genetic messages. As we saw in Chapter 2, genes are replicators who collaborate with each other to find vehicles, animals and plants, that can help the genes survive and reproduce. We also saw that our species is unique in having devised memes, cultural transmission in the form of languages, art, architecture, science, customs, and ways of doing things, including business enterprise. Memes may offer a way of controlling our genes and creating a new type of evolution. We also examined the theory of business genes, the most fundamental unit of value in business, similar to DNA, is a unit of useful economic information. This is a meme, but to distinguish it from non-business memes, we call it a business gene. Business genes include basic technologies, ideas, products, skills, and individual executives and entrepreneurs. To achieve their purposes, they combine with many other business genes and find vehicles for their replication. More developed technologies, corporations, large and small, markets, channels of distribution, and knowledge vehicles such as books, institutes, and university departments. Business progress flows from experimentation, new combinations of business genes, the creation of new business genes, and a struggle for life between the business genes. Corporations are throwaway vehicles for the replication of ever better business genes. Chapter 3 looked at the experiments of Soviet scientist G.F. Gauss on small organisms. His test tube wars demonstrated that with limited resources, organisms of the same species will compete to death, but organisms of slightly different species will cooperate to survive. Gauss also showed that if one species can invade another without the invaded species being able to reciprocate, the former will become dominant. He further demonstrated that there was a difference between coexistence, where one species can invade the other, and bi-stability, where neither species can invade the other. We concluded that business genes and corporations should differentiate themselves to survive. They should also find positions where they cannot be invaded by competitors, and preferably positions where they can become dominant by invading a species that cannot retaliate. Chapter 3 also considered the idea of ecological niches, unique ways of making a living in a specific place in the economy of nature. This reinforced the idea of specialization and differentiation being essential to prosperity. In Chapter 4, we took a tour into evolutionary psychology and speculated that there is a profound mismatch between the inclinations of our genes and the imperatives of modern business life. Our genes are still geared up for life in the Stone Age, before the invention of agriculture and commerce. Life on the savanna plain was hard and frequently threatened. Stone Age man survived by giving emotion precedence over reason, by making quick judgments on first impressions, by banding together in small clans up to a maximum of 150 people, by being friendly, specializing, and cooperating within the clan, by breastfeeding and mindless optimism, by conforming and herding, by being willing to fight other clans, by avoiding risk whenever there was not a direct threat to life, and by mad scrambling when there was. While some of these traits, such as a propensity to demonstrate friendliness and work constructively in teams, are functional for modern business, most of them are not. Evolutionary psychology helps to explain the pathology of many large organizations, where there is often a tension between the formal organization and the informal, the proliferation of informal pecking orders, an unhealthy taste for hierarchy, and unwillingness to take responsibility, the rejection of negative feedback, a socialistic attitude to rewards, continual bickering between different departments, functions, and locations, hostility to outgroups within and beyond the corporation, herding and conformism within it, the suppression of conflict and heresy, the tendency to expect unrealistically optimistic outcomes, avoidance of risk, and panic when things go wrong. We posited 2 remedies for the mismatch between Neolithic genes and modern corporate life. One is to adapt our behavior, to correct for our natural biases, to cool our emotions, to accept criticism, conflict, and contrary views, to use reason and experience to make realistic or even pessimistic projections, to collaborate with outgroups as genuinely as with the in-group, to take more risk than we want, to avoid seeking status or sucking up to it, and to behave reflectively and constructively when under pressure. The other way is to adapt corporate life to our genes and eschew organizations of more than 150 people. Finally, Chapter 5 examined the evolution of human cooperation. Humans have learned to cooperate and live in large, interrelated groups, societies of ever greater differentiation and complexity, linked by business relationships and trade. At the root of this process are business genes, things like customs, ideas, information, technology, and skills that can be passed on without sex or natural selection from one human to another. We saw that competition and cooperation were two sides of the same coin, comprising the links between business genes and their vehicles, and the way that wealth can be created by mediating the selfishness of each business gene and individual, and using that selfishness to create collective advantage, wealth, and progress. We also saw that cooperation is the more basic process, predating competition and requiring more conscious volition. Progress requires ever greater degrees of cooperation among cooperators willing to take a long-term view of the value of collaboration. Cooperators who look beyond individual transactions to an ongoing stream of transactions facilitated by trust and relationships. In Part 2, we leave biology and turn to physics in an attempt to understand another dimension of the power laws around us, the properties and interactions of matter and energy.